and welcome back to the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Thanks for joining us again. In this video, I'm demonstrating how I sewed the black bias tape onto the stained glass project. The bias tape has been glued to the front of the design, covering up the raw edges left by sewing the colored pieces of fabric onto the background. It is necessary to sew this black bias tape down so it will not come loose should the piece be washed in the future, because the applique glue is water soluble. By sewing it down, we also ensure that the bias tape does not come loose accidentally, and we make sure that any loose edges of the colored fabric is securely in place. The secret to a neat stitch is to make sure that you are stitching right at or right under the edge of the black bias tape, and that you use a black thread so it disappears into that bias tape. By sticking the needle in just slightly under the bias tape and then pulling it out at an angle, starting underneath the bias tape and coming out in the fold, you will ensure that your stitches are virtually invisible. With this project, I noticed that in some areas I had a little too much glue on the seam, and that made stitching a little difficult where there was too much glue. So be cautious that you use enough to hold it in place, but not so much that it causes you problems stitching. I also noticed that as I came to areas where several pieces of the black bias tape intersected, it was a little more difficult to stitch because you had to go through many more layers of fabric, and there was also glue in those areas. You may find that a thimble is helpful. And if you'll notice on the black bias tape in this video, there are some areas that have a white spotting or coating on the black bias tape. That is the glue that has come through the fabric and appears on the front of the design. Not to worry, since the glue is water soluble, we will be able to remove that later. I'm going to continue with this stitching all the way around. In the areas where you have a gentle curve to the bias tape, you will find that your stitching is much easier and goes faster. In some of the areas where the curve is sharper, or you have points, or need to adjust the fabric or the bias tape slightly, you will need to stitch more slowly so you can accurately place the binding or the bias tape into place, covering up the areas and securing it with your stitches. Personally, I find this type of stitching to be very relaxing. The only exception to that would be in areas where you're trying to tuck that bias tape underneath another piece of bias tape, and you're trying to stitch it into place so that you are sufficiently hiding the raw edges and keeping it secure and neat at the same time. That can be a little frustrating, and that's why I recommend that you make sure that you trim your bias tape. Being a little generous, you can always trim it a second time if it's needed, but once it's cut, it's difficult to place it into place when you're doing the stitching by hand because you're pulling it apart when you're trying to stitch, and then you're trying to push it back into place with your actual stitches. Be sure to tuck any stray threads underneath to make sure they stay out of sight. And as we finish up an area, I always take it to the back and make sure to secure the thread there with a small knot. And then I clip it really close to that knot. Here we've moved on to another section of the design, and I'm working in the little very center of the project. And this is an area where we're really forcing that bias tape to make a continuous arc to form that circle. And I started by stitching the outside of the circle first. And now I'm working on the inside and where the two ends of that piece of bias tape join together. It was a little fiddly to work in this area because you're really pushing that bias tape to its limits in order to be able to form a circle as perfect as it can possibly be and get it stitched into place. And here you can see I'm trying to get the end of the fabric tucked in so the raw edges do not show. Patience in this particular endeavor are very important because it doesn't necessarily cooperate with you with every stitch you take. Now that we've got that end secured, I'm starting to go around the design, being sure to tuck that bias tape in so that it does form the circle. This was probably the most difficult area of the stitching to do on this project because it's fairly small and it required more stitches in an inch that you would normally do because you're trying to hold that bias tape into the proper position. As we discussed in some of the prior videos, you need to think about how you want your bias tape to lay in this design. The goal is to make sure that all of the ends or the raw edges are covered by a subsequent piece of bias tape. That may require that you think through the most logical place to put your first pieces of bias tape, and then where to place the subsequent pieces to achieve your overall objective. Regardless of what type of work you're doing, this technique for sewing on bias tape can be used for many different purposes. I always like to refer to this stitch as an invisible stitch or a hemming stitch. It's something that goes on quickly and allows your stitches to be almost invisible. Sometimes you can see a little mark on the fabric where the fabric tucks in the spot where the needle is going in or the thread is pulling against the fabric. But the overall look is a stitch that is invisible, and it serves many purposes, from hemming a pair of pants to binding a quilt. I hope you've enjoyed today's demonstration and it has been advantageous to you. I'll let you watch the rest of the video, but be sure to consider subscribing to the channel and liking the videos. And we'll see you next week at the Shamrock Quilt Studio.